All right, my friends. Can you see and hear me okay today? Welcome. Give me a heads up in the chat room and we'll get right into it. Okay, thank you, Eileen. Always there, quick on the draw. Alrighty, my friends. Stand by, I'm going to turn the music on and I'll turn it off right away. Let's get that off there. Okay. Ecclesiastes 12:14 from the New International Version. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Today I know that all of you I see in the chat room, we are saddened by the news, the story of 14 Russian submariners being killed, fire breaking out in a submarine, a research submarine, and loss of life. Followed on the heels of the sad news that we heard from Saturday, Doug Hagman's son Joe Hagman having passed away last Saturday at the age of 36. So, a somber day, somber discussion today, but I would like to bring in some of the historical. I would like to talk about history of submarines and submarines on the bottom of the ocean and Howard Hughes and recovery of a submarine, the K-129, part of it. And we'll get into that historical story, but we'll do an overview today of what is known so far to myself. It does appear that this story is convoluted, to say the least. There's not much that's coming out. It's obvious from the lack of coverage that it's being suppressed. And so I will do the best I can from the reporting that I can share with you to let you know what I know of what has been going on. But given the stage of the world, the state of the world on the stage of the world itself today, this is significant in that tensions are high, and this is the last thing we needed, was a confrontation between Russia and the United States, potentially with the involvement of nuclear warheads, not necessarily being launched, but simply being on board vessels. Anytime submarines encounter one another and their hostilities break out, it always portends of the possibility of a larger scale conflict breaking out. So with that background, that's why we are discussing this topic today. I sent to you yesterday, as things were breaking, what was known. So much of what we're going to cover today is reflected in the articles from yesterday. As far as I can tell, there really isn't anything new today that has been learned, at least what I can find online. And I shared with you my typical sources, my go-tos. One of them is Debka file, which openly it's a Mossad operation, Debka file, but they do have a lot of military information that they present. None of it is going to be things that you couldn't find anywhere else, but it's just a ready source, and I go to Debka when things like this happen. So that's something you may want to file away. Okay, so just checking the chat room. I see we've got a good group in here as always today. Thank you very much for spending time with me. I appreciate your friendship. And all right, so I see everybody seems to be tuned in. We're working well, things are happening, so we will proceed right on with today. The submarine in question, let me just leave the camera running, but I'm going to let me go ahead and put up the image. I'll put up this diagram. You want to focus on the one at the bottom. This is the submarine Loshrik that is accompanied by a mothership. The Loshrik is a research vessel, as best as I can tell. Certainly there are a lot of other things I'll bring into the discussion about it, but Essentially, for an introduction, it's a research class vessel capable of somewhere around 19,000 feet of depth of operation. Most submarines operate around 2,000 feet, so that'll give you some perspective. It is brought into position by a mothership. The confusion today is that there appears that there was an encounter between a Soviet, or let's say a Russian submarine operating in Alaskan U.S. territorial waters, encountering a U.S. submarine in U.S. territorial waters. The second story is that there was apparently a submarine, we're told so far it's the Losherik, the research vessel that was operating in Soviet waters around about the same time, and that it was the Losherik that experienced an onboard fire, which you can appreciate inside a closed vessel is the last thing that you want to happen, and the loss of 14 submariners. Now it appears that the fire with the research vessel took place in Soviet waters somewhat concurrently, somewhat simultaneous to the encounter in Alaskan waters with a Russian submarine. It's not clear if the two operations, the two situations, the encounter in Alaskan waters involving a Russian sub and an American sub, in which a Russian submarine in Alaskan U.S. territorial waters fired a torpedo, and as one report, and I'll share with you, the word scuttled was used. Very unusual, and I'll explain why, but the word scuttled of a U.S. vessel, doesn't say surface, doesn't say submarine, a U.S. vessel was scuttled by this Russian torpedo fired in U.S. territorial waters. So this is, reflected in the actions of Vice President Pence flying literally to my neighborhood, and apparently his aircraft either never left the ground or en route was rerouted back to the airport. But he was headed for Manchester Airport, which literally is a 10-minute drive from my home here in New Hampshire, where he was scheduled to make a public presentation regarding opiate abuse right here in New Hampshire. So I'm also going to take you back in history to my former backyard, which was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and some personal experiences I had that are absolutely parallel to what is going on today, involving the Soviet submarine K-129 that sunk in the Pacific in about 3 miles of water due west of the Hawaiian Islands. And we will go into that historical story as it ties to events that I personally observed and experienced in the San Francisco Bay Area regarding K-129. And those of you that have read both of my novels, Overt Catastrophe and 48 Diamonds in the Rough, those pull together K-129, Howard Hughes, what is known as the surface vessel Glomar Explorer, the mining barge, Hughes mining barge, a submersible barge, a recovery claw device attached to the surface vessel Glomar Explorer, known as Clementine, a claw for the recovery of the Soviet sub in 3 miles of water of K-129, which had 3 nuclear-tipped missiles on board, as well as their code book, all of which were the target of the CIA for recovery in 1974. K-129 went down in 1968, and I will relate the story and unfold that for you in 1974 as I experienced the events that were unfolding as a young man while I was still at UC Berkeley in 1974. So, All of that is backdrop. Let me read the account that I think is the clearest. I have many tabs open, so bear with me. I'm going to scan through some of this, and we will read about the Soviet submarine K-129, but so far what I would like to do is define, first of all, the unusual word that was used in this one article I'm going to share with you, the word scuttling. Scuttling is a deliberate sinking of a ship by allowing water to flow into the hull. This can be achieved in several ways. Seacocks or hatches can be opened to the sea, or holes may be ripped into the hull with brute force or with explosives. Scuttling may be performed to dispose of an abandoned old or captured vessel to prevent the vessel from becoming a navigation hazard, or as an act of self-destruction to prevent the ship from being captured by an enemy force, or in the case of a vessel engaged in illegal activities by the authorities, as a block ship to restrict navigation through a channel or within a harbor, to provide an artificial reef for divers of marine life, or to alter the flow of rivers. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move on. All right, this is from Debka file, July 2nd. It's now July 3rd. The article highlights reports reaching Debka file's military sources about a U.S. submarine being intercepted by a Russian nuclear submarine in American waters opposite Alaska. Okay, I'll read that again. A U.S. submarine being intercepted by a Russian nuclear submarine in American waters opposite Alaska, where the Russian submarine escorting the nuclear submarine, responded with a Balkan 2000 torpedo and scuttled the U.S. vessel. And as a result, urgent consultations with both the White House and the Kremlin were taking place on Tuesday, July 2nd, in the night of Tuesday, July 2nd. Now, Pence was returned to the White House. Obviously, there were high-ranking consultations going on with Vladimir Putin, who also likewise canceled an event at the same time, and so it appears so far that a potential escalation of events was de-escalated by these urgent talks last night. Again, the mainstream media and even alternative media really doesn't have much more to present on this, and if they do, feel free to share in the chat room any updates that come up. Doug, I see that you have posted, Doug from Diamond Digital Media, who I rely upon absolutely to keep these live streams and the website operating, and our magazine, Entangled Magazine, so thank you, Doug. He's posted a, looks like an urgent update from Debka. Go ahead and indicate to me in the chat room if there's new information beyond what I'm presenting to you in these opening reports. The U.S. Vice President Mike Pence was canceled for making an appearance in New Hampshire. Okay, so we know that. Let me point this out to you again. Scuttled the U.S. vessel. This is in U.S. territorial waters, as far as the reports that we have so far, okay? You can well appreciate this is an act of war. You have a Russian submarine escorting the nuclear submarine. What nuclear submarine? So it must have been that the Russian sub was escorting the U.S. nuclear submarine. We interpret that because of the word intercepted by a Russian nuclear submarine in American waters opposite Alaska. Now that's one event there. Break this out. There's the second event, at least it appears to be a separate event. which is the Russian research vessel in which the fire took place. So, we're not sure if these are related. The research vessel was, the victims from the vessel were taken to the Russian naval base Severomorsk. I think it's how it's pronounced, Severomorsk. So they were taken to hospital there. What I'd like to do is I'll go ahead and put up some images here, and then I'll read some more. Again, this is the research vessel at the bottom, Losherik, and its mother vessel, at least in this illustration, Paltuas. Now, we don't know if that was the same mother vessel that was involved. Hard to say. Okay? Here's a map of where the naval base is located, Severomorsk. Here in the diamond, we have the naval base located. We come up to the geographical North Pole and continue over the top of the globe to Alaska. So this is the Atlantic down here. This is the North Sea up here, Greenland, Russia, Finland. And then if you go over the top of the pole, you come down into the Pacific by way of Alaska and the tip of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, tip of Russia right here. So through the narrow straits. Now it appears there was one event up here in the Alaskan waters, but we don't know where the research vessel was located. But the victims were then taken down through the pole, through the Arctic, down to the naval base Severomorsk. Let me come back to this. I'm going to leave this image up, and I'm going to read a little bit more about the research vessel. Okay, this is the research submarine Losherik. This is coming by way of Wikipedia. Project 210, or AS-12, Russian AC-12, nicknamed Losherik, is a Russian deep diving submarine. AC stands for something in Russian, from the official Russian naval term, and I can't read that, but the translation is Nuclear Deep Water Station. The submarine was laid down its keel in 1988, but it was not launched until August of 2003 due to financial problems. It's designated for research, rescue, and special military operations, and is operated by the Main Directorate of Deep Sea Research, reporting to the Military Intelligence Agency, GRU. Okay, its propulsion is a nuclear reactor, an E-17. On board are 25 officers, all officers on board. The pressure hull of the submarine is believed to be formed up to 7 interconnected spherical elements. This provides limited space for living quarters and equipment, but grants insufficient structural strength. The vessel is powered by a nuclear reactor and is believed to operate at depths of thousands of meters due to the unique spherical construction. Although the exact operational depth is unknown, it is known to have operated in about 6,000 to 8,000 feet of depth in the Arctic Ocean in 2012, and is capable of being carried by a modified Delta III class submarine. Now let me add to some of the research I've done on this. The spherical vessels are formed of titanium, and it is indicated that it is able to operate, because of the titanium construction, down to 19 to 20,000 feet in depth. So that's additional information that I share with you beyond Wikipedia. To continue from Wikipedia, the vessel has been described as a spy submarine that could possibly be used to tap into or sever underwater telecommunications cable. Russia has released little information about it officially, and there are few photographs of it. The clearest is believed to have been taken inadvertently during a Top Gear Russian photo shoot. The nickname Losherik comes from the vessel's multi-spherical hull and was taken from a Russian cartoon character, Losherik, a toy horse consisting of small spheres. Okay? Alrighty. So from Wikipedia, they actually have this incident. So let's go ahead and read this. A fire broke out on the vessel on 1 July 2019 while it was taking underwater measurements of the sea floor in Russian territorial waters. 14 of the crew were killed by inhalation of smoke or toxic fumes. 7 of those who died held the rank of first-rank captain, and 2 were recipients of the Hero of the Russian Federation Award. Submarine Commander Denis Dolonsky was among those killed. The fire broke out around 8:30 p.m. and was extinguished by the crew. The vessel was later towed to the Russian Northern Fleet base of Severomorsk, where 5 survivors were hospitalized with smoke poisoning and concussion. The incident was the worst loss of life on a Russian submarine since the 2008 K-152 Nerpa accident, which killed 20 men. The commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy launched an investigation into the cause of the fire, and President Putin was sent Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to monitor the investigation and report on the incident. Some journalists speculated that the men who died had sacrificed themselves to save the vessel by sealing themselves into the compartment where the fire broke out. The Norwegian Radiation Protection Authority stated that they had been notified by the Russians of a gas explosion aboard the vessel, though Russian authorities denied this. Okay, let me pull up another. This is from CBS. 14 sailors killed on fire aboard Russian Navy deep-sea submersible, dated 2 July, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Fire broke out, so we've got that coverage. Defense Ministry did not say how many sailors were aboard the vessel during Monday's fire, whether there were any survivors or if it submerged. So this was the early breaking story. The Russian media reported it was the country's most secret submersible, a nuclear-powered vessel designed for sensitive missions at great depths. Some Russian media said the vessel was an AS-12 nuclear-powered sub. However, there has been no official confirmation. Again, this was the early breaking story. The vessel is now at Severomorsk, the base of the Russian Northern Fleet. Okay, I'll continue on through this. The name is apparently explained by the unique design of the internal hull, made of several titanium spheres, capable of withstanding high pressure at great depths. In 2012, Losherik was involved in research intended to prove Russia's claim on the vast Arctic seabed. It collected samples from the depth of 8,202 feet. Some observers speculated the Losherik was even capable of going as deep as 19,685 feet. Analysts suggested that one of the possible missions could be disrupting communication cables on the ocean bed. The Losherik is carried under the hull of a mother submarine. The nuclear-powered Orenburg is the mothership, according to this article. Russian Navy also uses Prince-class and Buster-class deep-water vehicles, which have a hull built of titanium and are capable of operating at a depth of 3,000 feet. The small vehicles have a crew of 2 and are primarily intended for rescuing submariners. Okay, I'll scan on through this. All right, so we've got that piece. BBC early reports. Early report on BBC. Russian press says the sub on which the 14 servicemen died was an AS-12 Losherik, which is used for special operations. This was the same sub the U.S. claimed was capable of damaging undersea cables, accusing Russia of seeking to intercept or disrupt communications. Okay, that's a BBC tweet. Came in yesterday. All right, scanning through this. Again, it's not indicating whether the two incidents of the scuttled U.S. vessel by a Russian submarine, if that is connected. Okay. Let me check the chat room in case you guys have anything new that has come about beyond what I have. Okay, it looks like we're just going to continue on. All right, let me go on camera. Then we're going to take a step back into history. We're going to talk about the former Soviet, at that time, submarine K-129. Give me just a moment. Let me get a little air in here. Okay, I'm going to put this map up here just so we have a point of perspective on what's going on. Again, at the top of the globe here we have Alaska and Russia on the right-hand side of the strait, and then down at the bottom the Soviet base of operations in the northern Atlantic, Severomorsk. Okay? Now it's conceivable, and all I'm going to say here right from the beginning, this is conjecture on my part. I don't have any media reports. I'm going to provide to you sort of my conjecture of what was going on, because this will tie to a historical event, the K-129, that I'm going to share with you. So there's some precedent for what I am going to speculate about. Let's just take what we have been told so far. Whether this is accurate or inaccurate, we're just going to take what's been presented in the media. If the U.S. encountered a Soviet submarine operating in U.S. territorial waters off the coast of Alaska, and we have a Russian submarine that has ostensibly scuttled, it's torpedoed a U.S. vessel. It's not indicated in the reports if it's a surface vessel or a submarine, but let's just expect that it was a U.S. submarine that was torpedoed in U.S. territorial waters. That alone is an act of war. Okay? Let's talk about Alaska. Alaska primarily exists not for the oil, although the oil and other natural resources are important to the United States, but it is the location for HAARP, okay, the high altitude auroral antenna that heats the ionosphere. But it has always been, and especially up into the polar regions, it has always been a place of surveillance, electronic surveillance of the former Soviet Union and now Russia and the Ukraine, etc. Suffice to say, there's a lot of electronic warfare taking place in Alaska. There is surveillance that's going on, but there are also jamming facilities. And on top of that, the HAARP facility. Very sensitive area and highly protected. And you've heard reports of Soviet aircraft, back bombers, Soviet atomic equipped armed back bombers being intercepted by U.S. fighter aircraft, because the Soviets fly right over our airspace in Alaska, and they have flown in our airspace down along the western seaboard. Okay? And we always intercept them, and it makes the news, and all that goes on. This shadow warfare has been going on since the beginning of the Cold War, with both aircraft and submarines. So, to today's events, if the Soviets, and let's use the image of the Losherik with its Delta III mothership, if the Delta III brought the Losherik alongside the coast of Alaska, more than likely the Losherik was launched in U.S. territorial waters, because it has a limited operating range. I believe it has a 120-hour submersible operational capability of 120 hours. So the mothership's going to no doubt deploy the Losherik within U.S. territorial waters. Now, running between the U.S. and the Russian territory itself to Russia and China and down into Japan and the South China Sea are numerous undersea cables for telephone and certainly for internet, fiber optic cables for communications. The U.S. and the Russians have, and the Chinese, they have on the seabed monitoring devices. They have detectors. They have listening posts on the seabed. And this has been going on for 40 years now. They can listen to submarines and surface vessel traffic, but there are many that have been located on these undersea cables, both the old telephone copper wire cables and the more modern fiber optic cables. Now, this submarine, the Losherik, has the ability to literally descend to the seabed, and these cables typically are laid just below the surface. They use literally mining equipment, machinery on the seabed to bury the cable to protect it. You may have heard of stories over the past month or so of sharks attacking undersea seabed cables and biting them. It's because of the electrical impulses emanating from these cables, even though they're heavily shielded. If they're exposed because of shifting seabeds, because of storms and currents, if these cables are exposed, then it allows a very weak electric signal to escape the shielding from these cables, and sharks in their nose have detectors that pick up very weak signals. That's how they detect the presence of prey that are dying, prey that are sending out signals that they are in distress, and that attracts the attention of sharks. And so the sharks will attack these cables, and that's why they bury them, is because of this. So those same weak signals that are detectable by sharks are detectable by submarines that are equipped with sensors, not just satellite-based communications. Okay? So that's your overview, and that may be why the Losherik was there in territorial waters, was to place listening devices or sit on the bottom and conduct an active listening operation. So it may be that one of our subs detected the Losherik. Certainly it's likely it detected the mothership, probably a Delta III. Okay? Detecting the larger submarine and understanding the way that the submarine is modified to carry the smaller submarine and deploy and recover that smaller submarine and the mission of those two submarines, that would definitely get the attention of one of our subs. So the Soviet submarine, whether it was the Loshurik or just the mothership, was intercepted. No doubt there were warnings and communications that were communicated between the vessels. And let me share with you not that I know exactly the orders that are given to submariners, but here's the typical situation. You know that our military basically operates under pre-designated orders, standing orders, rules of engagement as they're known. And typically, whether you're a boots on the ground soldier, or you're flying an aircraft, or you're operating a submarine or a surface vessel, our military doesn't fire preemptively. The rules of engagement typically dictate that you don't fire back unless you're first fired upon. In other words, in defense. Okay? So let's use that as just our backdrop. Let's assume that if it was a submarine, a U.S. submarine, was operating under those rules of engagement such that they did not fire upon the Russian sub. But the Russians apparently felt that their operation and the detection of their super secret Loshurik submarine, that the detection had already been accomplished by our sub. And that the mothership, now you know there's a Russian bear, right? So what happens when a mother bear observes threats towards her cubs? The mother bear will die in defense of her cubs. Overlay that into the mothership submarine with her smaller Loshurik super secret submarine. And the mothership is going to fire first to protect the cub, the Loshurik. And I believe that's what's happened. Because of rules of engagement, our guys were not able to fire first. No doubt there were communications with the Joint Chiefs of Staff going on, Special Operations Command, even the President of the United States, and the recall of Vice President Pence during all of this or following all of this. We're not sure of the timing. So, to recap, what we have here is detection in U.S. waters of possibly two Russian submarines, mothership and the research vessel, surveillance vessel Loshurik. Our guys make every attempt to warn off the mothership, but the mothership has to recover the submersible before it can leave. Again, the Loshurik only has about 120 hours of air and battery power. And not strictly battery power, I should say nuclear power. It can run for extended periods of time, but it's the air. It's the capacity of air that limits the operational endurance of the smaller submarine, of the Loshurik. But no doubt the mothership wants to recover the smaller vessel before they leave U.S. territorial waters. Well, I would imagine that one of the objectives of Special Operations Command is to recover that super secret Loshurik. If they can succeed in separating the two vessels, and they can succeed in recovering the Loshurik, that would be an amazing intelligence coup for the United States. Now, those of you that may have fast forwarded on me already have already looked at the information from 1968 through 1974 on the K-129 Soviet submarine to see where I'm going with this conjecture. I believe the United States was going to try to claim the Loschrik because it was in U.S. territorial waters. Capture it. Well, what's going on with the Russian High Command? Well, they're going to tell the mothership, you do everything within your power to prevent the capture of the Loschrik, even if you have to fire on the U.S. submarine. And I believe that's what took place. The commander, the captain of the mothership, to protect the Cub, fired a torpedo. And I will say this, that if one of our subs was sunk, if it was destroyed, it was because the mothership and our submarine were in such close proximity to one another that U.S. countermeasures, decoys, etc., as well as firing one or more torpedoes in defense because of the rules of engagement, in defense, they didn't have the opportunity to defend themselves or to launch countermeasures because they were too close to one another. You can imagine the drama taking place within our own submarine. I mean, this is like a Tom Clancy novel, folks. But you can imagine scenes from The Hunt for Red October, okay? That our guys, they want to fire. They know that they're at risk. They want to defend themselves. They don't want to die. They want to fire on the Russian sub before the Russian sub fires. And so there are these frantic communications between our command and our crew. What do we do? Now, I'm sure that they have plenty of scenarios that have been worked out ahead of time, plenty of contingency plans for these kinds of things. No doubt our high command was well aware that our sub had detected both the mothership and the Lorentz, okay? And already what-if scenarios and orders were given. But in the fog of war, so to speak, things change. There are a lot of variables that come into play. On the world stage, big picture variables, and right down there, eyeball to eyeball under the water between two submarine commanders, variables at that location that can change standing orders, can change the rules of engagement. I'm sure that our guys were telling the mothership, leave the Lorentz behind, leave it behind. The Loschrik, I should say. The Loschrik, if I'm pronouncing it properly. And the mothership refusing. And the tensions building to the point where our sub was moving in the direction of the Loschrik to capture it. Now, how would they physically do that? They don't have, as I'm going to show you in a little bit, they don't have any grappling devices that I'm aware of. But they certainly could move within close proximity to then threaten the unarmed, as far as I know, the unarmed research vessel, surveillance vessel, spy vessel, Loschrik, force it to the surface, which upon surfacing would then be boarded by our U.S. seamen. The Russians will not want that sub to be boarded and captured, and all of their sensitive material and equipment being exposed. Okay? So it may be that underway was this forcing of the Loschrik by our submarine to the surface. Now, they could physically be doing that. They could physically be using the larger submarine to push the smaller submarine to the surface, or even to crush it on the seabed. And then, if they crushed the smaller submarine on the seabed, the U.S. would later, because it's U.S. territorial water, would then claim it and recover the vessel with the dead crew aboard. Not wanting any of that to play out, the Russian High Command said, go ahead and torpedo the U.S. submarine. Now, this is where I'm really going to stretch my conjecture, folks. This is going to 30,000 feet above the ocean. This is looking at the larger picture of what's going on in the world, the tension within the world. I'm going to take you to something that seems inconceivable. It is possible that our submarine was sacrificed. I'm going to go on camera here. It is possible that our submarine was sacrificed. It's possible that our president allowed our submarine to be torpedoed. Why would he do that? To prevent a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia. Okay, prevent a nuclear exchange. World War III. Why? Because the Russians were threatening to launch from the mothership or from other missile-equipped submarines to launch nuclear warheads on the United States. If we did not back off and allow the Loschrik to rejoin the mothership and then for both to depart U.S. territorial waters. No harm, no foul. You see, we don't know exactly what weapons have been pre-positioned and where. And I'm not talking just surface weaponry. There's been an awful lot of reporting in the alternative media over the last year that the Russians off the eastern seaboard of the United States in U.S. waters have deposited tactical nuclear warheads on the seabed. Effectively, landmines on the seabed. When I was in Western Germany in the 70s, the then Soviets had placed nuclear landmines, tactical landmines, and they were literally landmines, only about this big, had planted those landmines in various valleys in narrowing areas of the mountains. The purpose of which would be to set off nuclear devices on the battlefield to take the first advancing forces of NATO troops and tanks towards Russia and seal off those gaps to prevent the advancement. Okay? So this is technology's been around since the early 60s. Tactical landmines and seabed mines. Now, if we are that vulnerable and we have prevented the Russians from placing tactical warheads on the seabed off the eastern and probably western coastlines, that could be the big stick that the Russians were threatening the United States with, to detonate those, which would then produce tsunamis on both coasts, and certainly on the eastern, if those are the only ones that have been pre-positioned. Tsunamis, taking out New York, Boston, all up and down the eastern seaboard. Doesn't even require the launching of missiles. So why sacrifice one of our subs? Well, there probably was a fever pitch engagement between the Russian communications and the U.S. communications, and the Russians, not operating with the same rules of engagement, took preemptive action. They viewed the actions of the U.S. submarine advancing on the smaller Loshrik as an act of war. Even though it was in U.S. territorial waters, the Russians interpreted the advancement upon their smaller submarine, the threat to capture and recover the Russian submarine, as an act of war, that we had already done the first strike, even though there were no weapons that we know of. It was the actions of our sub, and I'm sure the actions of our sub came from Special Operations Command, came from the highest level, to try to recover that sub. That was interpreted by the Russians as an act of war. Therefore, the preemptive move was by the U.S. without any shots fired. But the Russians responded from their perspective as a defensive action, fired upon the threatening U.S. sub and took it out. Again, in such close proximity that our guys had no opportunity to defend themselves. They couldn't maneuver away. Firing of decoys underwater, countermeasures, and the firing of torpedoes just wasn't enough time because they were already so close to one another. You can appreciate the mother bear coming in close to her cubs to protect her cubs scenario. Okay? I know I'm kind of elaborating and kind of drawing this out, but I want to put on the record, so to speak, the step by step and the thinking, so that if we get any further information that's released, and we probably won't, most of this I think is just going to be covered up with false stories, false narratives that are put out. But I'm just giving you what I think had played out, but we will never hear of. It will never see the light of day. And I'll reinforce that never see the light of day by going back into history and talking about the Soviet K-129 incident in 1968, February 23rd, to be exact, of 1968. So, we always take a break at the top of the hour. Let's go ahead and do that. I'll put some music on. You guys take your break, and then we're going to shift gears back into history. Okay? So I'll put this music back on if I can find it. and I'll check the chat room and we'll see what you guys have been discussing. Just queuing up the music. I hope it won't be blasting your ears out when it comes through, so turn your volume down in preparation for the music coming on. And we'll take a break. Here we go. All right, we'll get back to it here. Some of you in chat were asking about the music. This is from Brand X Music. The album is Battle for Dawn. This particular track is Dark Matter. So Dark Matter from Battle for Dawn from Brand X Music. And yeah, it is pretty haunting. It is pretty creepy, some of the folks are saying in chat room, and I agree with you. And you know, this is a creepy discussion, this whole thing here. Let me read a further report, and this is specific to the U.S. submarine. Just making sure that there aren't any errors. If you guys can't hear me, just go ahead and let me know in the chat room. I'll keep an eye out. Okay, report. American submarine torpedoed and sunk off Alaska coast. This is from Hal Turner. Okay, this is Hal Turner Radio. This is from last night. This was an update. An American submarine operating off the coast of Alaska was reportedly torpedoed and sunk during a firefight with a Russian submarine after the American sub allegedly intercepted the Russian sub in American waters. The Russian submarine allegedly sustained heavy damage in the fight, with upwards of 14 crew killed, but it made it back to its base in Russia. He says he has calls into the Pentagon and to his intel sources seeking to confirm or deny the information. No word on U.S. casualties. Okay? So, since then, I have not been able to find any other information denying or corroborating, confirming any of this. It does say here that while this was taking place, the European Union headquarters in Brussels, Belgium, called an emergency meeting of the EU National Security Council, and separately the British government called a COBRA meeting for its government. Also, there were reports that in Israel, the shift change of military troops was stopped. It was interrupted, and the off-going crew, military crews, don't know exactly, you know, whether this is just within headquarters or with the intelligence services or where, but apparently they didn't let everybody go home, and they kept everybody, you know, on full alert. So the Israelis, of course, responding, as I'm sure all the governments around the world were responding to this incident. So that report from Hal Turner was that an American submarine operating off the coast of Alaska was reportedly torpedoed and sunk during a firefight with a Russian submarine. Okay? So we don't know, and I'm speculating, I'm stretching this out, this is conjecture as to what I think may have taken place out there. This is extremely tragic, and I pray that none of any of the men on either side, Russian or U.S., were killed or injured. We know that from the reports there were certainly loss of life from the Russian side of this incident. Let's go back into history. Because as I said at the beginning of this, there's been precedent for this. Okay? In the summer of 1974, a large and highly unusual ship set sail from Long Beach, California. It was headed to the middle of the Pacific, where its owners boasted it would herald a revolutionary new industry beneath the waves. Equipped with a towering rig and the latest in drilling gear, the vessel was designed to reach down through the deep, dark waters to a source of incredible wealth lying on the ocean floor. It was billed as the boldest step so far in a long-held dream of opening a new frontier in mining, one that would see valuable metals extracted from the rocks of the seabed. But amid all the excited public relations, there was one small hitch. The whole expedition was a lie. This was a Cold War deception on a staggering scale, but one which also left a legacy that has profound implications nearly half a century later. Okay? I'm putting up the map right now of the Pacific this time. You see Pearl Harbor in the middle and Long Beach to the right, Midway off to the left, and just above, just north of Midway Atoll, the atoll Midway. And we know Midway from World War II, okay, is a location where a Soviet submarine, the K-129, went down in 3,000 feet of water. This is just south of what we're talking about today, just southwest of Alaska. Okay? Again, precedent having been set. There's a picture of Howard Hughes for those of you that don't know who Howard Hughes is. Long since deceased. Very reclusive billionaire. And you may have heard of this book and the cover story, the project name, the CIA project from 1968 through 74 called Project Azorian, the raising of the K-129. So I'll leave this and I'll come back and detail some of what's going on here, okay? The real target of the crew on board this giant ship, the Glomar Explorer, which was a Hughes vessel, was a lost Soviet submarine. 6 years earlier, the K-129 had sunk 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii while carrying ballistic nuclear missiles. The Russians failed to find their sub despite a massive search, but an American network of underwater listening posts had detected the noise of an explosion that eventually led U.S. teams to the wreck. It was lying 3 miles down, deeper than any previous salvage operation. The weapons and top secret code books were surely beyond reach. But in the struggle for military advantage, the sub represented the crown jewels, a chance to explore Moscow's nuclear missiles and to break into its naval communications. So the CIA hatched an audacious plan, Project Azorian, to retrieve the submarine. That would have been hard enough. But there was another challenge as well. It had to be done without the Russians knowing. The spies needed to create a smokescreen, so they pretended to be exploring the possibility of deep-sea mining. A PR campaign conveyed a determined effort to find manganese nodules. Okay, these are little spheres on the seabed containing manganese, a valuable metal that typically is formed by volcanic tectonic activity. Okay, they're molten and then they solidify, they cool and solidify into these balls, these nodules on the seabed. These potato-sized rocks lie scattered in the abyss, the great plains of the deep ocean. There had to be a front man, someone rich and eccentric enough to be plausible. The reclusive billionaire inventor Howard Hughes was perfect for the role. He agreed to take part, and in his name, a unique ship was designed. Publicly, it was fitted with everything needed to dig up the seabed. But covertly, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was also built with ingenious devices straight from a Bond film. The ship's hull had enormous doors that could swing apart to create a moon pool, an underwater opening large enough to accommodate the Soviet sub and keep it hidden. Tucked away out of sight inside the ship was a capture vehicle, which had a giant set of claws to straddle the sub and secure it. It took until 1974, 6 years after the sinking of the sub, for the CIA to be ready. The cost of the project, $500 million, was equivalent then to building of a couple of aircraft carriers or launching an Apollo mission to the moon. No one had ever attempted anything on this scale in such incredible depths. The sub itself had a weight of nearly 2,000 tons, but the 3 miles of thick steel pipe needed to haul it up added even more. New systems were needed to keep the Glomar Explorer in position as well as to handle the huge load, and everyone on board was nervous. But even more alarming was the suspicion of the Russians. To convince them that Howard Hughes was genuinely interested in nodules, executives were dispatched to conferences on ocean mining, where they described in detail their plans to harvest the rocks. We made ocean mining seem a lot more credible. We really misled a lot of people, and it was surprising that the story held together for so long. This comes from a CIA operative. The cover was so good that it prompted U.S. universities to move to start courses in deep sea mining, and it also whipped up the share of prices of the companies involved. People thought, if Howard Hughes is into it, we need to be too. We even collected a few nodules, which was fortunate because Soviet spy ships kept a constant vigil and once even came close enough to overhear the Americans' conversations. When we realized they were right alongside, we started talking about nodules, like, here's a good one, so it looked like we were checking them. Yet another complication arose. The project needed calm weather, and that was only likely in summer. But just when it was about to begin in the summer of 1974, U.S. President Richard Nixon was visiting Moscow for a peacemaking summit. Being caught stealing a Soviet sub would not exactly have helped, so Nixon insisted that the operation could not begin until he had left Russia. That was on 3 July. By then, the Hughes Glomar Explorer was in position, and the winches whirred into action the next day. Things did not go smoothly. Huge vibrations rocked the ship as the capture vehicle was banging back and forth in the waves. But on 30 July, they watched as underwater cameras relayed video of the sub, as well as dozens of crawling crab-like crustaceans and a big white fish that looked like a shark. Amazingly, the giant steel claws successfully seized the sub, but then disaster struck. At some point on the way up, the immense strain became too much. Part of a claw snapped off, and most of the sub slipped back to the seabed. Only the front section made it up. The bodies of 6 Soviet submariners were recovered and were later given a formal burial at sea, but the missiles and code books were never found. The CIA official history asserts that the operation was one of the greatest intelligence coups of the Cold War, but it had cost vast sums, and questions immediately arose about its value. A year later, the sensational details became public, and plans to recover the remaining section were abandoned. The revelation that the deep sea mining project was a fake was a sudden shock to other mining companies, and also to diplomats at the UN, who were right in the middle of negotiating future rights to ocean minerals. Share prices tumbled amid a wave of recriminations. This might have derailed the very notion of deep sea mining for good, but in fact, it proved that with clever engineering and a lavish budget, it was possible just to operate in the otherworldly depths. It's really difficult, but we showed it could be done, said the CIA spokesperson. So there's your backstory, the overview of it. Let me share a couple of pictures for you. This first one that I have up Pictures the Glomar Explorer surface vessel, and the doors in the bottom of the hull opened and deployed, and the moon pool, as it was called, is visible within the ship. Now that's sealed off so the rest of the ship, of course, can float. Now, deployed just below that, you see a structure. This large rectangular box is what is known as the Hughes mining barge. This is actually a floating dry dock, okay, that you would see in a shipyard, and they would float the ship in with the dry dock partially submerged a few feet below the water, allowing a ship to be floated into the dry dock, and then the water is pumped from the tanks of the dry dock itself, allowing the dry dock to rise in the water, and with it taking the ship that they want to repair within the dry dock. Okay, and of course the dry dock is dry at that point. Well, this Hughes mining barge, as it was called, has a unique feature. It has a roof, and this roof is retractable. So this barge was built in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was built by Lockheed Martin in the South Bay, right there in the Silicon Valley. It was public. People could see it. You could motor by on a motorboat, on a sailboat. And you could see this huge barge. But why did it have a roof on it? Because inside this dry dock, they were secretly building what was known as Clementine. And let me show you a picture of Clementine. This is the claw that I was just reading to you about. Okay? This is Clementine, which was used to grasp the hull of the K-129, and by way of being attached to the Glomar Explorer using pipes. Now these were drill pipes. Howard Hughes made his first money, his wealth initially, because he patented drill bits. Drill bits that had 3 wheels that were intermeshing, and in those intermeshing wheels were diamonds, industrial diamonds. And that could penetrate through rock. It literally would grind rock to penetrate down into the earth, and those drill bits were connected by hollow pipes, drill pipes. And those pipes would penetrate down, and they would discover oil or natural gas, and up through those pipes they would pump oil and natural gas. So the mining technology of Hughes was used to lower Clementine by way of these pipes and the derrick on the deck of the Glomar Explorer. So it looked like a legitimate mining ship, and they were using mining technology to lower and then recover Clementine with the submarine. Okay? So here's the Glomar Explorer, the surface vessel. You can see in the center the derrick, which serves as a crane to lower 360-foot lengths of drill pipe. And the drill pipes are screwed together. They're threaded on both ends. So they would lower a section, stop it, bring a new section in the derrick, line it up, and thread it together. And they would continue to do that. Well, it took them 2 days to lower Clementine 3 miles to the seabed, to the submarine, by slowly adding section after section of drill pipe on the Glomar Explorer. And below the derrick is the moon pool, with the bottom of the hull forming as the doors that would open up. So here's a close-up of the Hughes mining barge when it was in the San Francisco Bay. You can see the doors, the roof that are retractable on top, and within this barge they assembled the Clementine claw system. The reason for the roof was so that Soviet spy satellites couldn't photograph what was going on inside the barge. Again, a very clandestine operation, very elaborate. So this barge was built simply for the purpose of hiding the existence of Clementine. because that would have nothing to do with the mining of manganese nodules from the seabed. So they had to keep it very secret. They towed that barge from San Francisco at the north by tugs down to Long Beach. And just off the coast, and there are many photographs of beachgoers observing this. This was done in the light of day. The floating Hughes mining barge with Clementine firmly ensconced inside the barge with the roof closed, they sunk it. And this is very shallow water. And it was shallow because they needed to be able to utilize divers, scuba divers, to attach cables. So here we go. They're sinking it and Clementine's inside. This is an interior view of the Hughes mining barge. The roof is closed. You're looking down on the top of Clementine, this claw device, obviously highly engineered. You can see the propellers here and towards the back. These are for stabilizing, for maneuvering and holding in position the claw as it's descending down 2 miles to the seabed. So they had propellers, one at each corner, to keep it in a geosynchronous position. Here's the control room for Clementine, the claw device, inside of the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Now down below, these are artist renditions. These are not actual photographs, but these are artist renditions of what it looks like when Clementine is on the seabed and its claws, its arms, have pulled together from both sides, have closed the claws around, lifting up and capturing the submarine itself, the K-129. Now when they did this, they first tried to close the claws. The tips of the claws struck the hard seabed underneath the silt. Now they didn't have time because it took 2 days to lower Clementine. It would take another 2 days to retract, to recover Clementine. They didn't want to take that time to recover Clementine and inspect for damage that they suspected might have been sustained when they hit the seabed during the first closing of the claws. So they went ahead and proceed with a second closing. This time they were able to gather up the submarine, but unbeknownst to them, one or maybe 3 of these claws were fractured. Okay? So I'm putting up a picture here, if it'll come up. Well, apparently it's not coming up. But raising the sub during the operation, 2 of these claws or 3 of these claws fractured, and it allowed 2/3 of the submarine, including one of the missiles, nuclear tipped missiles. One of the missiles actually floated out, drifted out of the silo, its launch tube, and floated back down to the bottom. And when it hit the bottom, let me get my notes here, when that nuclear warhead struck the bottom, it was traveling, let me get my notes to be accurate here, I know it's not a big deal, but it was traveling at 48 miles an hour, I believe was the number. No, excuse me. The nuclear submarine drifted out of its missile tube, the nuke, and it was traveling 80 miles an hour when it hit the seafloor. There was no detonation, but you can imagine you've got all these guys up on the surface and they're trying to hold their breath while this thing travels 80 miles an hour to the seabed. Fortunately, obviously, it did not detonate. Okay? They did recover 38 feet of the submarine. They did recover some of the bodies, many body parts, but they did not recover any of the warheads nor the code books that they were after. The warheads were of value in and of themselves to be able to back engineer their present technology. That was valuable. But the code books were of more value. None of that material was recovered. Okay? Let's see if I can find that picture. Give me just a moment. For some reason it didn't get captured. Yeah. Okay, so let me go back to, now that you have that understanding of the operation. Let's go back to the beginning. So this is the artist's rendition of Clementine coming into position over the K129. Okay? I think we can remove that. Pretty elaborate operation, and then the distance, is not being demonstrated. This is obviously compressing the distance, but 2 miles down, the submarine was sitting on the bottom. If you look up Project Azorian, if you look up K129, you'll find many pictures that have subsequently been released, actual photographs by the CIA of the submarine, and most of it is pretty much crushed, and that which escaped Clementine and plummeted back to the bottom, it also sustained heavy damage when it impacted the seabed. Okay? Now, I'm going to take you forward in time. I'm going to put up a couple of pictures because the Hughes mining barge was recycled long after this event concluded in 1974. The Hughes mining barge was still around. Clementine was scrapped. Who knows what happened to the Soviet sub, the portion of it that was recovered, but I'm sure that was spirited away to some laboratory and was thoroughly analyzed and back engineered for whatever they could glean from it. Okay? Here's another view of the operation. Again, this is in Long Beach. Hughes mining barge, the HMB, is fully submerged on the shallow seabed, and they had divers that were assisting this operation, but the doors are open in the Glomar Explorer, and here they are hoisting up using cables, using a crane system, winches, to winch up Clementine out of the barge up into the ship, again, so that Soviet spy satellites were not able to see what was going on. So very clever idea, very clever way of getting the Clementine inside this ship, doing it underwater. Again, like a James Bond movie. Just fascinating. But the Hughes mining barge was recycled, and I'm sharing with you an image that I'm posting right now of the interior of the HMB with the roof closed, and what you see pictured inside now, the dry dock, pumped dry, and the barge is sitting on the surface. It's not submerged, but this is a prototype. This is a naval vessel. This is a stealth naval vessel. It's sitting on a, if you will, a table. Okay, it's sitting on a prop to hold it up to carry the weight of the hull, because the pontoons below are intended to be under the water. The pontoons are basically submersible. This is what's known as a semi-submersible surface craft. This is Sea Shadow. So if you want to Google Sea Shadow, This is a stealth ship, research ship, built by Lockheed and built inside the Hughes mining barge. Again, not visible from satellite because of the roof. So they're continuing sort of this same thought process. They get you another picture here. This is, come on. I want to show you sea shadow one more time. This is again inside the barge. Those of you that are familiar with, I think it's the F-18 stealth bomber and stealth fighters, having these flat angular panels on the aircraft, that was employed on this surface ship to make it stealthy, to reduce its radar signature to surface radar on the ocean. Okay? Alrighty. Now, this is where my two books, Covert Catastrophe and 2048 Diamonds in the Rough, come into play, because sea shadow is part of the story. It's in the novel. We actually use sea shadow. We use the Hughes mining barge in the storyline, and the Golden Gate Bridge that's pictured here. And just outside the Golden Gate Bridge, off to the right of this image, is where the conclusion of Covert Catastrophe takes place. Okay? So you may want to read my books, because I do have some historical and technically accurate information that I've shared within the fictional narrative. Here's another view of sea shadow as it's moving through the San Francisco Bay. Towards the end of its secret operations, it would, under its own power, it would be deployed through the San Francisco Bay at night. It's not a submarine. Part of it is submerged. The pontoons that provide its buoyancy are under the water. And the rest of the ship remains above the water, semi-submersible. So they were testing its radar signature to commercial radar and also military radar systems in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. And they did that at night. Once they had finished all of this, they then began daytime operations and sort of showed off this very unusual vessel. It has since been scrapped. Okay? But I got to use it in my novels. Got to have a little bit of fun with it. Now there's another evolution to the Hughes mining barge story. And some of you may remember this, but it's kind of been forgotten. It had a lot of publicity for a while when this first happened. But we go from the Hughes mining barge, and some of you may have guessed this already, to something else that was going on in the San Francisco Bay Area back a few years ago, called the Google barge. You remember that? Let me see what you guys are saying in chat. See if you remember that. Okay? These are essentially shipping containers stacked and welded together on top of a commercial barge, just an average everyday barge. Now Google was very secretive about why they were building these. They built 4 of them. Okay? They wouldn't even tell the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard, because they're from the Department of Transportation, have full authority and full authorization to board any vessel in U.S. territorial waters, certainly the San Francisco Bay, and inspect that vessel. Okay? Google would not allow the U.S. Coast Guard to enter these containers. And the Coast Guard actually had to go to Congress and the Department of Defense to get authorization to force Google to allow them to board and inspect. Google put up these cover stories, like Hughes did about the manganese nodules. Google put up the cover story saying, these will be public areas for the demonstration of Google Glass. Remember Google Glass? Those glasses? Those augmented reality glasses? Supposedly spending millions of dollars for 4 barges, East Coast and West Coast of the United States, Google barges, as entertainment centers, as display centers. Sure, sound like manganese nodules to me. Note that on top, these vertical bars, these tubes, these are antennas. Okay? This one here is pictured at Treasure Island. Again, I factor in the Google barge and Treasure Island into my 2 novels. You couldn't make this stuff up. I'll give you another image of a Google barge. Here's a aerial view. I'll do that again. My program's lagging. It's a little slow getting this stuff up there, so there. Here's an aerial view. Now this is when the Google barge was being moved by tugboats to Stockton, up the Sacramento River, up the San Joaquin River to Stockton, California, which is inland. It's in the central San Joaquin Valley of California. So they took it up to the port of Stockton, and it remained there for a couple of years, and supposedly it was scrapped. I don't know whether this has actually been scrapped or not. And I don't know the disposition to the other 3. I will offer this to you, though, and this is pure conjecture, absolute conjecture. Maybe these were forerunners to what I'm showing you right now, the so-called FEMA barges. Looks pretty similar to me. May have been prototypes. Just speculation. Don't really know. Okay. Let's go back to the map in the Pacific. The K-129, 1968 through 1974. You see Long Beach on the right, where the Hughes mining barge deployed Clementine into the Glomar Explorer. The Glomar Explorer eventually was scrapped, but just a few miles down the road from where I grew up in the Bay Area in Lafayette, there's an area in the San Joaquin Straits there. Benicia, there's a Benicia Bridge. Interstate 80 crosses the Benicia Bridge, and as you're crossing heading north towards Sacramento, northeast towards Sacramento and Interstate 80, if you looked off to the right of the bridge as you were traveling over it, you would see what is known as the Mothball Fleet. And these were World War II Liberty ships and other old ships in Korean War and Vietnam War naval vessels that were anchored together in the fresh water of the river. And Glomar Explorer was pulled in there, and it was there for, I want to say, about 10 years. And many times I would travel over the Benicia Bridge and look down and see the Glomar Explorer sitting right there. It was unused after this operation to recover the parts of the submarine. So again, this is where in later years I factored all of these personal experiences into my novels. So you can see Long Beach where the Glomar hoisted up Clementine, and then it left from Long Beach and headed out into the Pacific. And you can see how this is just south of what was then the Soviet Union. And it was international waters, it wasn't Soviet territory. So we had free ability to navigate those waters and do what we wanted to do. Now the Russians did send spy ships out there, and if you read the book, come on, the account of this, it's fascinating. I mean, you had these Russian vessels, one of which I'm picturing here, that came, as the story I read to you, came right up alongside, but most of the time we're sitting, within hailing distance, so to speak, of the Glomar Explorer, and they were watching, and they had in those days, no ability to detect what was actually going on underwater. Now, I'm sure the Soviets suspected that the U.S. were trying to recover their submarine, but the Soviets had not, up to that point, had the technology to be able to locate their submarine themselves. What had happened back in Hawaii were the underwater listening devices, the sonar, if you will, but they're passive underwater hydrophones, underwater microphones, hydrophones that were used to listen to the movement of surface ships, but more specifically the movement of submarines. So we had an array of these throughout the Pacific seafloor, listening to submarines. And when the K-129 exploded, our intelligence operatives, listening through the hydrophones and with their instruments recording and displaying this explosion, which actually was an implosion because of the depths that the submarine was operating under. So they heard the implosion, and they triangulated with their multiple arrays of hydrophones, triangulated the exact location of the K-129. And that set forth this whole operation by the CIA in 1968, authorized by then President Richard Nixon, to recover this. So picture this going on out here in 1968, and I find it fascinating that this is just south of what just transpired within the territorial waters just off the coast of Alaska. Now, will a recovery take place? No, because the submarine made its way back, if this is in fact the same incident. If we don't have two concurrent events taking place in two separate locations, then we have the Losherick having head back to its naval base at Severomorsk, probably brought back by the mothership due to the smaller submarine's limited operational capability. But be that as it may, you can see similar dynamics, similar sensitivities taking place today as would have been experienced in 1968 at the loss of the K-129. That the Soviets in those days, the Russians today, not wanting sensitive technology to fall into the hands of what are considered to be the enemy. We are still the enemy of Russia, obviously. That's why NATO still exists. If you will, the Cold War is still going on. And again, my experience in what was then Western Germany with nuclear warheads in Germany, which were not even supposed to be public knowledge, it was still considered secret information. But we had artillery-based warheads based on missiles on tracked vehicles that could be moved in the tactical battlefield into position and then tactical nuclear warheads employed against ground-based troops. This was the U.S., this was the NATO defense against the overwhelming numbers of Soviet tanks at the time. We had about a 1 to, I think it was 50 ratio of NATO tanks to Soviet tanks. So we also had nuclear tactical landmines deployed, as well as the Soviets. We had landmines for the same purpose, to stem the flow of Soviet tanks coming into the NATO territory, specifically into Western Germany first. Okay? So you can see my fascination. I've lived through the history of this stuff, and many of you have as well. And it's interesting how the Lord put me at Berkeley and then took me to West Germany and then brought me back to the Bay Area. And then we have all of this going on with the Glomar Explorer prior to my being deployed to Europe, but then returning, and we have Sea Shadow, and we have the Hughes mining barge being used for Sea Shadow, and then we have the Google barges. So I took liberties with all of those things and factored them all in. Now I want to share with you something that happened about a week ago that's also in 2048 Diamonds in the Rough. I shared with you an article regarding, I think it was an F-15, but at least it was an IDF, an Israeli Defense Force fighter jet that crashed on the island of Cyprus. Those of you that have read my 2048 Diamonds in the Rough know that a great deal of the story takes place on the island of Cyprus. That's in the Mediterranean, just south of Turkey, off the coast of Syria, and likewise off the coast of Israel. Between Cyprus and Israel and Syria is the largest natural gas field in the world. The largest discovery of natural gas is what is known as the Leviathan seabed. It's under the seabed, okay? It's in the rock strata. The largest natural gas deposits in the world that have yet discovered. That's been claimed by Israel. Think about the hook in the jaw. Gog Magog. That's extremely valuable to someone like Russia. Gazprom, they would love to take control of Leviathan. Leviathan is in Revelation, is it not? Perhaps tomorrow we will delve into talking about, from the biblical perspective, we'll talk about Leviathan. But that is a hook in the jaw. You also know that in the Golan Heights in Israel, in controlled Israel territory, there is now, well over a year it's been acknowledged, the discovery of the source, if you will, the central well, the source of all of the oil that flows out through the sands, through the strata, throughout the Middle East, is sourced in the Golan. And just a few weeks ago, maybe 5 weeks ago, it was publicly acknowledged that one of the largest gold deposits in the world was discovered in the Golan. Hooks in the jaw. Natural gas, crude oil, and gold, all controlled by Israel. Why did I select Cyprus for 2048 Diamonds in the Rough? I put myself in the shoes of a general or an admiral, thinking about where would I want to set up a base of operations? What would be a strategic location for the foreseeable coming wars? I also factored in the island of Patmos, just to the north off the coast, northeast of Cyprus, off the coast of Turkey, where Revelation was written. And that is in the storyline, as are the 7 churches in Turkey, are all in the storyline. But Cyprus was selected for its strategic location, because from Cyprus you could operate not only naval vessels into the Mediterranean, but also aircraft operations, and certainly a great location for radar installations. And since World War II, the British have operated on Mount Olympus. Okay, on Cyprus, there's a Mount Olympus, a radar installation that covers virtually all of the Mediterranean. Certainly the coastline of Turkey down into Syria and along the Israeli coastline is all bathed in radar operated by the British from Mount Olympus. And one of the pivotal scenes in the storyline takes place in that very radar installation on top of Mount Olympus. Olympus I chose not only strategically, but because of its historical significance, its mythological significance. Now, the Russians in present time, present day, for about 30 years, they had a very small naval footprint at the southern end of Cyprus. But a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago, Cyprus, the government there, authorized the Russians to expand their naval footprint, their naval operation on Cyprus. Hook in the jaw. Cyprus is to the south controlled by the Cypriots, but divided by a United Nations demilitarized zone running a band running horizontally across the island, with the northern portion of Cyprus controlled by the Turkish government. Very interesting. Okay? So pay attention to Cyprus. An Israeli fighter jet landed on Cyprus. You see how close it is to Syria and the operations that were underway there? Pay close attention to Cyprus. Okay. Ecclesiastes 12:14. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Now, whether we're going to get any more public information about what happened off the coast of Alaska, we don't know. Whatever we get is going to probably be deception, probably going to be lies. But there's another historical event I want to conclude with today. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's what we're experiencing right now today. That's how close it's come. And for many years in Cuba, and this is not well known, the Soviets still had in the 60s, even after the missiles that were taken off the launchers, loaded back on board the Soviet ships, covered with tarps, escorted due to the naval blockade that the U.S. Navy had instituted, escorted the Soviets back out into the Atlantic, sent them on their way. What was left behind in Cuba were tactical nukes, artillery-based, on mobile vehicles, very much akin to what I was involved with in Germany in the 70s. Back in the 60s, the Soviets had in place tracked vehicles with short-range artillery missiles tipped with tactical nukes, small, low yield, but still tactical nukes that could reach out to Miami, could reach as far as Louisiana, possibly into Texas. But certainly the U.S. mainland was still under Soviet threat for about 4 years. and eventually those were removed. So the missile crisis just didn't end with the end of the naval blockade. The tensions between the U.S. and Russia really have never ceased. They have waxed and waned. But I think when you look at K129 and the sensitivity of that operation, and you look at the sensitivity of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you look at the sensitivity around the deployment of our THAAD and our Patriot missile systems in Turkey and in the Ukraine, and the battle that's going on politically over Ukraine and into the Baltic regions now, coupled with what is happening in Syria and the influx of at least 100,000 Iranian troops and missile bases in Syria, and then Hezbollah, in Syria, and Hezbollah also in the Palestinian-controlled territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and all of the flexing of the muscles by the Israelis. I'm surprised that Damascus even exists. I'm actually surprised that what took place with these submarines off the coast of Alaska didn't have a triggering effect of a preemptive strike by Israel. Isaiah 17, Jeremiah 49, and overnight Damascus ceasing to be habitable because of the launch of tactical nukes, artillery-based tactical nukes by Israel on Syria. That's why I gave you this whole elaborate presentation today. I think it's important that we realize the times that we're in, not to be fearful, but again, to realize that this is according to God's plan and God's timing. And prophecy is unfolding. We are not, as the Kabbalists, trying to, through technology, hasten the return of the Mashiach, the Antichrist. We are not, through prayer, trying to hasten the fulfillment of prophecy. We don't want Damascus to be attacked. There are many, many Christians in Damascus. Arab Christians. Okay? The origins of the 12 tribes of Israel is Syria. There are a lot of Jews in Syria. So, all things to consider. I appreciate you allowing me to provide my conjecture as to what I think took place off the coast of Alaska. I don't know whether one of our subs was actually lost, but the Tal Turner report indicated that the scuttle, as the word was used, took place. But here's where I started when I defined scuttle for you. That it is an act that one initiates to sink your own vessel. So I'm going to go way out on another limb in conjecture land. It's possible, and I alluded to this, but it is possible that our own crew, our captain, our captain in command and first officer were transmitted coded information to scuttle their own nuclear sub to prevent the launch of intercontinental ballistic missiles, to prevent World War III. I don't know, but it is very odd that the word scuttle was used in conjunction with a Russian submarine launching a torpedo and sinking our submarine. To say that it was scuttled is odd, because that is something that you would initiate upon your own vessel. I don't know. Maybe our guys were sacrificed to prevent World War III and scuttled their own sub, taking their own nuclear subs to the nuclear warheads to the bottom, their missiles to the bottom. I don't know. I hope not, and I hope our guys were not killed by a torpedo either. I doubt we're ever going to hear the true story, just like Project Azorian, the true story of K129 didn't come out until there were early reports. The Los Angeles Times broke the story about what the Glomar Explorer was really doing, broke the story about raising the sub. That blew the story wide open, but all of the details, whether bodies, whether code books, whether nuclear weapons were recovered, none of that came out until almost 30 years later. So we may not, in the near term, find out what really happened. Whether we scuttled our own sub to prevent World War III, whether our sub was torpedoed and World War III somehow was averted through negotiations, through personal conversation between Trump and Putin, we don't know. Maybe we'll learn some of it. Prayers for anyone that was killed, anyone that was injured. Russian, U.S., whoever. We need to pray for peace, folks. We need to pray that Damascus doesn't vaporize overnight. We need to pray against Ezekiel 38 and 39 unfolding. We need to pray for the peace of the Middle East. I thank you for listening today. I hope this broader perspective and even the conjecture helps in some fashion, not to promote fear, but just so that you have an understanding from the bigger picture of what's playing out on the world stage. For whatever it's worth, that's my analysis of it. I thank you. I'll leave the chat room running for 30 minutes if you like, but that's pretty much all I had to say today. We'll get back together, Lord willing, tomorrow. Probably get back into more of our classroom discussion that we typically like to do. And certainly anything that I become aware of that I feel I can share with you, I will. It's all public information, but I'll share what I come across about these events. Okay? So God bless. Thank you for your friendship. I hope you've read the very densely packed July edition of Entangled magazine. It's philosophical, and it's very dense. It's very narrative driven. There are not many pictures in it, not many graphics in it, but it packs an awful lot into just a few pages. Again, I'm trying to give you backstory, trying to give you big picture perspective of how did quantum mechanics come about, where it's sourced from, and how is it operating today. Who's driving the agenda of quantum mechanics on the world stage. So, thank you. God bless. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.